fancy. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm bringing you my final odds and ends wrap-up for the month of September. Now this wrap-up is going to include a summary of what I ended up reading for the Because Dragons Readathon, which was, I think, the only Readathon I participated in September. I've already done several reviews and small wrap-ups for things that I've read in September, so where those apply, I will direct you towards those videos. Now the Because Dragathons, woohoo! The Because Dragons Readathon was September 4th through 10th. There was a set of challenges. There were 5 challenges. I'm going to tell you what they were. The first was to read a blue fantasy book. 2 was to read a swashbuckling fantasy novel. 3 was to read a fantasy book that reminded you of the fall. 4 was to read a classic fantasy book. 5 was to read a fantasy book with wings on the cover. Now I only ended up completing 2 books during that period of time. They covered between them 3 of those 5 challenges, and then I started but was not able to finish books for the other 2. So the books that I finished during the Because Dragons Readathon week were number 1, An Alchemy of Masques and Mirrors by Craddock. This was a NetGalley arc that I had, and I was super excited that it fit the swashbuckling fantasy theme. There ended up being not quite as much actual sword fighting in this as I guess I would have hoped for a swashbuckling novel. There was a pretty good sword fight at the end though, but the whole trappings of it are that it looks a whole lot like Three Musketeers-ish in its setting. Except for the fact that it does take place on a fantasy world with floating continents, and it's kind of steampunkish. I gave this 4 stars, and I've done a full review of it, which I will link for you. The other book that I read during the Because Dragathons week was A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine. This was both my classic fantasy book and my blue fantasy book, because my edition here is blue. I'd had this read aloud to me as a very small child, but I remembered very little specifically about the story. I did remember that it creeped me out incredibly, and I think I will stand by this. I think this is a genuinely pretty creepy little book. Also, even though it's considered a children's classic, I would almost be tempted to call it YA, because I think that if I was reading the ages of the characters right, 2 of the 3 main kids were in high school. Mostly my reaction to this as an adult is that it's a very weird little book. It's very short, and it goes really like big scale with some of the good versus evil stuff. Not a lot of things are really explained, and what happens is downright weird. I will say I am glad that books this weird become classics. It gives me hope for the future classics potential of some of my newer favorites. It was more skeletal than I was expecting it to be. There were a lot of things that I was expecting were going to be explored in greater detail that just weren't. The ending felt a little ambiguous to me, because the implication is that even though these kids got what they wanted out of this adventure, they achieved their goal. It was just this small portion of this ongoing cosmic fight that we only saw this tiny bit of. I also kept expecting Calvin's presence in the book to be further explained, and it just wasn't. But there's a lot that's cool and like sort of science-y about it. In terms of genre, you could make an argument that this is science fiction. The things in it are described in scientific ways. There is like interplanetary travel and aliens and things, but it happens in a way that's not like plausible space travel solutions. I would definitely call it fantastical. And that central intelligence, which is freaking terrifying, that's what terrified me as a kid, it reads to a modern sci-fi reader like some sort of AI computer system, except that this was written for kids in the early 60s who wouldn't necessarily have identified, oh, AI computer system, and it's literally like a pulsing brain on a table. Happy Halloween! Anyways, this was a weird little book. I am glad I have read it. I definitely will be seeing the movie because that intrigues me incredibly. I gave it 3 stars. So the things I started but did not finish during the Because Dragons Readathon. Second NetGalley arc on my Kindle. This one was The Dreadful Tale of Prospero by Alexandra Bracken, which ended up being less of a win for me. I only gave this 2 stars. I did a full review if you want to watch that. But this was for a book that reminds you of fall. It's very definitely a seasonal Halloween book. It's book 1 in a middle grade urban fantasy series about a boy named Prosper. Turns out he's got a demon inside of him. It's gotten some very positive hype on BookTube, but I was disappointed in it. So as I said, if you want to hear more, check out my review. And then the other thing I started during the Because Dragons Readathon, but finished later in the month, was His Majesty's Dragon by Naomi Novik, for a book with wings on the cover and, you know, dragons. This is the first book in the Temeraire series in the UK. This is published as Temeraire. This is one of those books where it feels like everyone has already read it except for me. And now I've read it too. So I think this is a pretty formulaic dragon book in a lot of ways. There's a hatching of a dragon who bonds with the human protagonist who raises the dragon, and then man and dragon do great things. That sort of thing. It's incredibly easy, escapist, fun reading. It has really charming characters, and it is alternate Napoleonic Wars in a world with dragons, and it leaves plenty to be explored, I think, in the rest of the series with regards to dragons in this world, so I'm very interested in continuing on with the series. One of the things that I tend to look for in any dragon book is this a book where dragons are animals, or is this a book where dragons are people? Like, if you were using sci-fi terminology, are these an intelligent species or a not intelligent species? In this book, dragons are definitely intelligent, although they're not necessarily seen as such or treated as such by the human population at large. Domesticated dragons are used to form an aerial corps for the military. They hatch with the ability to speak, and they bond with the officers who are going to become their captains. And the aerial corps in England is pretty insular and sort of obeys its own set of social rules that people outside of the aerial corps are not necessarily aware of. The main character of this book, William Lawrence, is a Navy captain whose ship captures a dragon egg from a French ship. And it turns out that this egg hatches aboard the ship, and the dragon bonds with Lawrence. So Lawrence has to go with the dragon Temeraire and become a captain of the aerial corps. Now, I said this is a pretty formulaic book. Of course, it turns out that Temeraire is a very special sort of dragon, and no one really knows what he's going to end up being capable of when he grows up. Temeraire is an exceptionally intelligent type of dragon bred by the Chinese, and he is just generally curious about a whole lot of things, and it's incredibly charming. And so we follow Lawrence and Temeraire training in the aerial corps as Temeraire grows up, and of course by the end of the book, Temeraire saves the day in battle, which shouldn't be a spoiler because, as I said, it's a pretty formulaic book, so it's not like you don't see it coming. I gave this book 4 stars. I'm sure I will be continuing on with the series. So to backtrack a bit, I did finish one book in September before the Because Dragons Readathon started, and that was ODY-C Cycle 1. This is a bind-up edition of this graphic novel series by Matt Fraction and Christian Ward. This is a sort of gender-bent sci-fi mythology thing based on mostly Greek mythology, starting with the Odyssey, but then kind of going in other directions too. I did a graphic novel wrap-up / double review where I talked about this and the other big graphic novel bind-up that I read in the month, which was A Redtail's Dream by Minna Sundberg. This is based on Finnish mythology. It is a web comic that I read in a massive print bind-up from interlibrary loan, but you can read the whole thing online. So if you'd like to hear what I thought of those two graphic novels, that's a pretty massive video because they were both pretty massive books. So I'll direct you to that video. The next thing I read in the month was much smaller. This is The Refrigerator Monologues by Catherynne and Valente. This is a novella-length book, and it is about women getting fridged in a comic book superhero universe. This follows a group of women in Dead Town, which is the afterlife of this superhero universe that she's created for this story. They meet up at a cafe and they tell their stories in monologue form. The format of this is inspired by the Vagina Monologues, which is a feminist monologue play that you may be familiar with. This book did the trick for me in that it got me like super pissed off, angry, which I think I need books to kind of sometimes come around and do every once in a while for my own sanity. Basically, my takeaway from this is that each of these characters sort of should have been the protagonists in their own stories, but then it turns out in some bitter twist of events that ends up in them in Dead Town, that they were just a supporting character in some male hero's storyline. Now, I have very little cultural understanding of superhero universes at large. I haven't read superhero comics, nor have I seen many superhero things. Before I read this, I read an article that the Barnes & Noble Sci-Fi blog did where they talked about each of the characters in various pre-existing superhero franchises that are sort of the inspirations for the separate characters in this. I found that very helpful, so I'll link that in case you want to read it. But I found that even without a whole ton of knowledge, a lot of these stories rang really true for me. Like, there are things in a lot of these stories that I think are deep enough embedded in our culture and in our sort of general understanding of how superhero stories work that I still recognized them even if I didn't know the actual stories they were inspired by. I recognize that, yes, this is a way that I understand female characters get treated in media narratives, and I got pissed about it. I wouldn't say that all of the stories were, like, equally resonant with me. I like the story of Blue Bayou and the Atlanteans in this book. Like, that didn't fit any of my preconceived notions of what happens in superhero stories. But I guess I'm learning things. I gave this 4 stars. I do have one more graphic novel that I read in the month of September, which possibly should have gone in that graphic novel wrap-up, but that graphic novel wrap-up was way too long already as it was, and I forgot about this. This was Wires and Nerve by Marissa Meyer. This is the first book in the extension graphic novel series, companion series for the Lunar Chronicles, which is a series that I enjoyed back when they were being released. They were like my top guilty pleasure YA series for a really long time, and I sort of wish that the author had just let that series end when it ended instead of trying to make this happen, even though it's about Aiko, which is a character who I wanted to see more of. She's the sassy android sidekick, and so this is how she's getting her own story. But I think the charm of the Lunar Chronicles series for me is the fairy tale retellings, and how they sort of blend into the main story arc without you noticing until you realize, oh, this has been a fairy tale. And this isn't a retelling of anything, and I wish that if she was continuing to write in this series, in this story, that there would be more fairy tale retellings. My main problem with this, though, was the art. The art in this is by Doug Holgate, and I just think the character design isn't good. Like, I've heard people saying that the characters in this didn't look like how they imagined them in the series, and that's true. But I think it's going to be universally true for everyone regardless of how they imagined the characters, because let me see if I can find a good page to show you this. Here, right at the beginning, we're shown basically all of the main cast of characters on a one-page spread, and if you'll notice, the artist doesn't have like a variety of ways he depicts faces. They're all kind of variants on like one or two models, especially the female characters. If you'll notice, like, that is Cinder, that is Scarlet, that is Cress, that is Winter, and that is Aiko, and they've all got basically the same face with different coloring and different hair. Literally, there was a scene in this book where Cress showed up wearing a different shirt, and I thought we were being introduced to a new character because that is how similar all of the female characters in this look. And I think no matter how you envisioned all the characters in this series, you envisioned all of those characters looking really different from each other. So the art in this is not all that good, but what about the story? This is about Aiko hunting down some of the wolf soldiers from the main series that are loose on Earth causing trouble. I will say that the wolf soldiers are, I think, plot-wise, one of the weakest links of the main series. They really don't make any sense except in the context of wolves being a symbolic fairy tale animal. And so you forgive the inexplicable wolf soldiers in the main series because you needed a wolf for Little Red Riding Hood and all of that. But without the fairy tale context, I'm just reminded of how little the wolf soldiers made sense in the first place. But I can't really hate on this story because, you know, I like Aiko so much. In the aftermath of the victory of the main series, all of the characters are being hailed as heroes, except for Aiko. No one cares that Aiko exists, even though she was just as heroic as everyone else, because she's an android, and that means people don't think she's a person. And she is predictably pissed off about this. And this was a really quick read, and I did enjoy reading it, so I gave it 3 stars. Here's the thing, though. I feel like almost everyone on BookTube has that one series where they know it isn't all that good, but they read it at the right time to get them hooked on a series, and it helped get them back into reading for whatever reason, and so they love it. And for me, that series is the Lunar Chronicles. But I know it has problems. I know there are things that are not great literature about this series, and so being asked to read more that is newly written in this series, it's like I'm ready to move on as a reader, but the author isn't letting me go. So I am intrigued by the fact that it looks like the next volume in this series is going to have a different artist. We'll see if I read it or not. And then the last thing I finished in September was a 3rd NetGalley arc, and that was The Beautiful Ones by Silvia Moreno-Garcia, which is a fantasy of manners. This was one of the books I talked about in my last video, which was a double review video, so please check that out if you are interested. This is like total easy reading courtship romance fluff, and I tore through it. I enjoyed it a lot. I gave it 4 stars. There's only a very little magic in it. There's some telekinesis, but if you're interested, please check out my review. I'm losing my daylight, so I'm gonna wrap it up. Let me know if you've read any of these books or if you're planning to, what you think. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.